Scripture reading this morning for Brother Darren's lesson will come from Numbers 32, 1 through 27. 32, 1 through 27. Now the children of Reuben and the children of Gad had a very great multitude of cattle. And when they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, that behold, the place was a place for cattle. The children of Gad and the children of Reuben came and spake unto Moses and to Eleazar the priest and unto the princes of the congregation, saying, Adaroth and Dibon and Jazer and Nimrah and Heshbon and Elilah and Shebam and Nebu and Beon, even the country which the Lord smote before the congregation of Israel, is a land for cattle, and thy servants have cattle. Wherefore, said they, if we have found grace in thy sight, let this land be given unto thy servants for a possession, and bring us not over Jordan. And Moses said unto the children of Gad and to the children of Reuben, shall your brethren go to war, and shall ye sit here? And wherefore discourage ye the heart of the children of Israel from going over into the land which the Lord hath given them? Thus did your fathers when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. For when they went up unto the valley of Eshcol and saw the land, they discouraged the heart of the children of Israel, and they should not go into the land which the Lord hath given them. And the Lord's anger was kindled the same time, and he sware, saying, surely none of the men that came up out of Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore unto Abraham and Isaac and unto Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me, save Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, and Joshua the son of Nun, for they have wholly followed the Lord. And the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years, until all generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was consumed. And behold, ye are risen up in your father's stead, an increase of sinful men to augment yet the fierce anger of the Lord toward Israel. For if ye have turned away from after him, he will yet again leave them in the wilderness, and ye shall destroy all this people. And they came near unto him and said, we will build sheepfolds here for our cattle and cities for our little ones, but we ourselves will go ready armed before the children of Israel until we have brought them unto their place. And our little ones shall dwell in the fenced cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return unto our houses unto the children of Israel, until the children of Israel have inherited every man in his inheritance. For we will not inherit with them on yonder side Jordan or forward, because our inheritance is fallen to us on this side of Jordan eastward. And Moses said unto them, if ye will do this thing, if ye will go armed before the Lord to war, and will go all of you armed over Jordan before the Lord until he had driven out his enemies from before him, and the land be subdued before the Lord, then afterward ye shall return and be guiltless before the Lord and before Israel, and this land shall be your possession before the Lord. But if ye will not do so, behold, ye have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. Build your cities for your little ones, and folds for your sheep, and do that which hath proceeded out of your mouth. And the children of Gad and the children of Reuben spake unto Moses, saying, thy servants will do as my Lord commandeth. Our little ones, our wives, our flocks, and all of our cattle shall be there in the cities of Gilead. But thy servants will pass over, every man armed for war, before the Lord to battle, as my Lord saith.
Good morning, everyone. Big crowd. I'm not used to seeing this many people, so it's exciting and a little intimidating for me because I'm not the guy that preaches up here all the time like some of these other guys. So hope I'll present something that's beneficial to you and makes you think a little bit. A lot of people come out on I was talking to Matt. Easter's for the religious community. It's a big time of year. I mean, I think I remember. I went to a Catholic college and if I remember right, like you couldn't miss Easter, be a Catholic. You had to come at least Easter. Maybe there was a couple others, but this was always one that they had to come to, because that's when the Lord was risen. I mean, they equate that holiday to, that's the tied back to Jesus' resurrection. But I'm not going to preach about that today. Zach's been teaching a study on, I started it, he's been teaching on Sunday night, this book right here. Very interesting book, very long book. And if you're not into history, you might think, man, this thing's never going to end. But it's very exciting because I like that book a lot. because all these names that you can't ever pronounce and all these places that you can't pronounce, you're like, they become real. When you look at the geography and you look at the history of the Bible, you can kind of put this together, and these stories become more than just abstract things in places that you've never heard of or seen before. They become, the geography becomes make a little sense to you. And then you can kind of understand the things they had to deal with. When they didn't cross over this, they didn't cross over this because it was a mountain range and it was 2,000 feet high. It kind of helps you in your study of the Bible. The stories are the same. The people are the same, but if you kind of look at this book, kind of helps a little bit better with the understanding. Thank Jared for that long reading this morning. That's kind of lengthy, but I thought it was good to get through it. We're going to study a lot today in Numbers. So if you want to get your Bibles out and start in Numbers chapter 32, we'll be starting there. So as we've been studying on the Wednesday night study, the Israelites, we know they wandered around for 40 years. And that story was recounted in that reading right there. Why they had to wander? They went they sent their fathers up, and they were afraid, so they couldn't take it, and so God punished them, except for Caleb and Joshua there. Everybody else died off. It was over 20 years old. And so here they are. They're starting to, the people have died out, and they're starting to move back into the promised land again with the second time. And we start our story here. It says, prior to Israel's occupation of the promised land, the tribes of Reuben and Gad wanted to settle in the east of the Jordan. You also remember in that story in the Old Testament, they didn't have anything to eat. God had to feed them quail and manna. That's all they were eating, right? That's all those people ate for all those years. But somehow along the way, they gathered up some livestock. As the people were dying off, they've equated some livestock. And so they started to conquer some of the land. They've gotten successful at that. These two tribes happen to be farmers, and they recognize that land of across they call it the Transjordan there, was very good for livestock. It's right along the Jordan River. And if you remember in our classes, you guys that have been here, you saw on the chart there, that was a green area. It's very flush and fertile. They realized, hey, this is a good place to raise cows. So they go to Moses there, and they request a response in Numbers 32, 1-27. We just read it there. They said, hey, we'd like to stay here. So let's look into the story here. There's that chart you kind of recognize from Wednesday night there. There's the east side of the river. Most of the ground that the Israelites conquered and lived in was on the left side of the Jordan River. There was a lot of it went north, up and down the Sea of Galilee, etc. But these two tribes down here, that was the first part that they conquered, and they decided they just like to live there. So there's a chart we recognize from their studying on Wednesday night. Reuben and Gad expressed their desire to Moses. So Numbers 32 and 1 again, we'll start back there again. Now the children of Gad and the children of Reuben and children of Gad had a very great multitude of livestock. And when they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, the region was the place for livestock. So they recognized this is a good place to raise our cows. We don't want to live right here. This is our spot. They saw that the Transjordan was prosperous. It was a good, the valley was good for raising cattle. And they requested, they said, we'd like to live there. Let's look at verses 3 and 4 there. Well, I'm not going to read all the names of the areas there. That's the parts of the places they wanted to take. And thank you, Jared, for suffering through that. Verse 4, the country in which the Lord defeated before the congregation of Israel, a land for livestock, and your servants have livestock. Therefore, they said, if we have found favor in your sight, let this be a land given to your servants as a possession. Do not take us over the Jordan. What they're saying is, we don't want to go. We're good right here. We just stay. This will be our part, and we'll stay here. That's what they're saying. And so let's look at Moses' response there. Numbers 32 and 6. Moses calls these guys out. And as Matt talked about in his lesson today, we don't like to be called out a lot of times. That's kind of hard to take, and nobody likes to be considered wrong. Verse 6 there, Moses said to the children of Gad and the children of Reuben, shall your brethren go to war while you sit here? That's the title of this lesson. So he's like, you guys are actually going to want to stay here and let everybody else go keep on fighting. Is that really what you're saying? So he called these guys out in the request. I don't think it was a bad thing that they said this is a good place for us. I don't think he would have had an issue with that. I'm okay with, you staying here, But the fact that you don't want to go on, that was the problem. Because the children of Israel, the land was given to all of them, not particular sections. But he called them out for that. So let's look at the rest of his story here. It says, shall they be at ease while your brothers must fight? You just want to stay here and take care of your families and build your cities? Did these men and women not help you fight for your section? So again, Moses is pointing these things out to these guys. And they could have said, well, that's fine, but I'm staying right here. All right, but that's not how the story goes. They realize that. Let's look at how Moses reviewed the request, though, in verse 7. So like I said, he didn't take it laying down. Verse 7, now why will you discourage the heart of the children of Israel from going over the land which the Lord's given you? So again, that's what happened. And we'll see some more in the rest of the story there. Actually in verse 8, thus your fathers did when I sent them away from Kadesh Barnean to see the land. If you remember, Zach talks about that. They did a lot of wandering in that area when they were, as those 40 years went. That's kind of where they were at. That's where they were when Moses sent them out to go spy the land. And they said, he goes, this is the same thing that your fathers did when I sent them, and they came back and discouraged everybody. They would be no different than the 10 spies, Numbers 32, 8, and 9. Let's look at the rest of the next verse there in 9. For when they went up to the valley of Eshcol and they saw the land, they discouraged the heart of the children of Israel, so that they did not go into the land which God had promised them. So here they are again, discouraging the rest of the congregation with their unwillingness at this point in time to continue fighting for the rest of the Israel that God had promised. This also, as a result of that, it risen God's anger against those Israelites that time. Verse 10, continuing the story. So the Lord's anger was aroused on that day, and he swore an oath, saying, verse 11, surely none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and above shall see the land which I swore to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me. So again, this is that whole story that we've studied and known. God was angry with them. He didn't give them a second try, and they actually went out. Refresh yourself the story when this happened. The Israelites got scared and realized what they'd done. When after the 10 spies came back and they said, we're not going to do it. They're scared of it. God got mad at them and they realized they made a mistake, and they tried to go fight and say, oh no, we'll go. Too late. They got defeated and came back with their tail between their legs, because God wasn't with them at that point. They'd made a mistake, and he was done with them. And here they are again, 40 years later, starting to make the same mistake again. Let's look at Numbers 32 and 14. They said this would be a broodful men that would increase God's anger even more, just like their fathers had done. And look, you have risen in your father's place, a brood of sinful men, to increase still more the fierce anger of the Lord against Israel. So Moses is warning them, like, we're going to create or recreate history here. You're going to do the same thing that your fathers did and turn the Lord against us again if you continue in this behavior. I think they came to their senses after they realized that, because apparently the 40 years of wandering had an impact, because these people were part of that too. These were the ones that were less than 20 years old. So they had been through that already. They knew what that was like to wander around and be lost and homeless. And I think they've become to realization that's not what they want to do. They actually came to an agreement with Moses after explaining it to him and talked to him. They came to an agreement. Let's look how this turns out. Numbers 32, 16 through 19. If you want to follow along. Then they came near to him and said, we will build our sheepfolds here for one livestock and cities for our little ones. But we ourselves will be armed, ready to go before the Lord of Israel until we have brought them to their place. So we've got ours, then they'll have theirs. And our little ones will dwell in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every one of the children of Israel has received his inheritance. For we will not inherit with them on the other side of the Jordan and beyond, because our inheritance has fallen to the eastern side of Jordan, which is what we saw on the map there. So again, they must have thought about it. And you don't know the amount of time that's passed in this whole conversation. It may have been right there at the same time. I don't know. But again, this is how the story plays out. But they recognized that was not the place, or not the correct way to proceed. And they want to make sure that got rectified before the Lord turned against them again. So Moses accepted their proposition there. Let's look at Numbers 20 through 23. Then Moses said to this thing, if you do this thing, and if you arm yourselves before the Lord for war, and your men and your armed men cross over the Jordan before the Lord, where he has driven out the enemies before him, and the land is subdued before the Lord, and then afterward you may return and be blameless before the Lord and before Israel, and this land shall be your possession before the Lord. If you do not do so, then take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. So he warns them. He's like, okay, I'll accept your offer. Just realize if you back out on this, this is what's going to happen. He made him a promise and he made him a deal there. He said, if you do what the Lord's told you to do, you'll be an inheritance. But if you don't, your sin will find you out. And if they back down the agreement, the Lord would turn against them again. So let's look at 1 Corinthians 10 through 11. How does this tie back to us? Because you always look at these stories in the Old Testament, and like, that's great. And a lot of times it's like, well, how does that mean anything to me in my day today? So that's why let's try to look and see, well, how does this apply to us? So he said, your sin will find you out. Look at 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 if you want to flip over there. We're going to do a lot of Bible flipping today, so get yourself ready for that. I didn't put the verses up on purpose to kind of, I think sometimes our handhelds and our putting our slides up kind of can be a handicap as we forget to flip through the Bible on occasion. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 here. Now, all these things happened to them as examples, that they were written for our admonition, and upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So these things are written down so we can look at those and learn from those stories and see how those can make our lives better with the Lord. So that's a reference to finding about your sin and how that's going to come back and haunt you. So let's look a little further to see if we can find some more application today. Just like those Israelites were at war, we're not in a physical war, but we ourselves are in a war every day. We're in a war with Satan. Let's look at 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. You want to flip over there, 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. So the Israelites were warring according to the flesh. They were actually having hand-to-hand combat and conquering lands. We are not doing that here. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and everything that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of God. So our fight is not a carnal fight, a physical fight. Our fight is a spiritual fight. We're in a war with Satan and the spiritual forces of his wickedness. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 18. Ephesians chapter 6, 10 through 18. Finally, my brother, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you might be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole body of armor of God, that you might be able to withstand that evil day, or according to and done all to stand. Stand therefore, having girded up your waist with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. And above all things, taking the shield of faith, which will help you to quench the fiery darts of the devil, or the wicked one in this version. So again, Paul equates it. This is in our time, many years after the Israelites have had their physical conquer. He again warns us against the war with the devil that we have, and those are the tools that we can use in our armament to fight against the devil. We fight this battle as members, and we serve in areas such as evangelism and edification and benevolence. That's the war that we fight in, and that's the places that we serve in. So what we're trying to get to, if you haven't figured this out already, is where's my part in all this? You need to find your place. You need to find it as those two tribes did. They found their place that they had to continue fighting, and we need to find our place and make sure we're fighting in any or any method that we can. Much has been done up to the present from others that fought before us. It came out of the denomination, fought against the changes that were present in our time. Against innovations that might lead to apostasy. Many have fought against things like that over time. And, we've did some studies I know Rick did some studies on Campbell back in the church was founded and set up in this part of the world. He was a pioneer of this area, setting up congregations in this part of the world. We also, Missy's been doing some studies on her family tree. They got a big reunion coming up. And there was a guy named Jimmy Gallagher. I know a lot of the older people know him. That guy was pretty famous in this part of the world for, not that he was, I guess in the work that he did, and the amount of preaching he did. Didn't he stay with Delia? Is he the one that would stay with Delia when he was doing preaching? So, I mean, he said he would spend a lot of time on horseback preaching, and we did some studies on it, but that was one of Missy's relatives that did a lot of work in this part of the world. Again, that's just things that happen in the world in which we live, in this little dot on the map here in Barnesville and Belmont County. But there's a lot of people that's done work ahead of us and fighting is what I'm trying to get at, fighting for the Lord. Every thought that we must be brought captive to Christ. Let's look at 2 Corinthians 10:5, if you would. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 5. Casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. So our bounties of war, if you will, those prisoners that we captive are our thoughts. And we have to keep those captive for the Lord there, as he points out in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. We must continue to stand strong against the wiles of the devil. Remember in Ephesians 6:11, that last verse, he says, equip yourself with the shield of faith, help you stand against the wily devil. And that's our protection, is that shield of faith that we carry in front of us. And that's to fend off the fiery darts. Let's continue on our slide. There's not a whole lot of bullets here, mostly bullets here. Then we have to consider ourselves. Should we stand while our brothers go to war while we sit here? Are we guilty of that, just as those two tribes of Israel were? Are we sitting around while somebody else is out fighting and working for the Lord? This is the question we have to ask ourselves. Are we sitting around while somebody else is out fighting? We can be guilty of this by letting others do the work for the Lord's army. And we're just kind of sitting by and watching the war play out. Shall we just sit around enjoying the efforts of others? Are we guilty of that? Maybe we're not. Maybe we're all working as hard as we can. This is a question I just want us all to think about. It's easy to get busy in our day-to-day lives and wrapped up doing what we do and trying to live and just move around. But we always got to remember why we're here. We're here to serve the Lord and to fight for him in any way which we can. If we're not actively involved in some type of work for the Lord, we need to consider that and look and see if there's an adjustment we need to make in our lives. And what's the big deal if we are? What makes the difference? Is that going to make a difference in the world? That's a question you might ask yourself. Maybe it doesn't matter, or maybe it does. Let's look at the effect there. For one thing, it discourages people. Just like Moses pointed out there, he said, you're discouraging the rest of the congregation by you're not doing your part. He pointed that out. Let's look at Numbers 32:7 again. I'm going to flip back over to Numbers. We got to be real careful that we're not being a discouragement to somebody else by not doing our part, I guess. It says in verse 7, he said, now why will you discourage the heart of the children of Israel from going over to the land which the Lord has given them? So that was one of the dangers of what they were doing. They were discouraging everybody else because you're stopping your work. What's the danger of that? Well, these other folks that are trying to press on, they may get tired and get burned out. Says, I'm done. I can't fight anymore. I'm fighting by myself. I'm just done. I can't do this anymore. So by us not, contributing and kicking in, pulling on that rope, we're dragging others down. We could be. Maybe we're not, but it could happen. That's a risk. Let's look at Proverbs 8 and 9. Another warning for us if we're having that issue. Proverbs 18 and 9. I'm going to flip over to Proverbs. He who is slothful in his work, he is a brother to him. He who is slothful in his work is a brother to him who is a great destroyer. So being slothful destroys other brothers. And I think that's kind of what Moses was getting at there in his warning to those. Their lack of participation was going to destroy the rest of the congregation. If we don't be a gatherer, I believe we are if we're not pulling, we're against him. Let's look at Matthew 12 and 30. I think let's see what Jesus said about that. Matthew 12 and 30. Matthew 12 and 30. He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters abroad. So if you're not, you can't just be neutral. The Lord doesn't allow that. You're either pulling for him or you're not. You're pulling against him. So, and that was the option here for those Israelites. They didn't have an option just to stop and watch and see how it turned out. He was saying you have to commit to this and keep pulling and doing your part. Just like sitting on a wagon instead of pushing or pulling, you can't be a passenger in the middle. You either got to be pushing the wagon or pulling it. You can't be riding. That's just the way this works for us. What will be the end result? I skipped ahead of my slides there. What will be the end result if we do this? Let's look at Numbers 20 or 32 and 23 again. Numbers 32, back in Numbers again. But if you do not do this, and take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and you will, but be sure your sin will find you out. That's quoted in the New Testament also. That your sins will find you out. For what does it? For what does one do if he doesn't do it for the church? It affects the Lord. We got to remember that. Paul learned this when he persecuted the church over in Acts chapter 9. If you want to flip your Bibles over there, Paul came to that realization. Doing all those things he thought was right as a Jew, he realized he'd made a mistake. Acts chapter 9, 1 through 5. Then Saul, which is what he was called before he became an apostle, then Saul, breathing threats and murders against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. And he asked for letters from them and from the synagogues of Damascus, that if he found any who were of the way, and that way is capitalized in the Bible that I'm looking at here, which means Jesus' way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound into Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near to Damascus. And suddenly a light shone from him. Then he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? Then the Lord said, I am Jesus, who you're persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So Paul realized right there that what he thought he'd been doing was the right thing was completely wrong. He'd been fighting. He thought he was doing it in the name of religion, thought he was doing the right thing. And he found out he was doing the wrong thing, fighting against the Lord. If we sin against the brother, we sin against Christ. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 12. 1 Corinthians 8 and 12. If you want to flip over there. And quoting Paul here. But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So we can remember our actions that we do can sin against our brothers. And if we sin against our brothers, we'll sin against the Lord. There's what Paul points out in 1 Corinthians. We need to be sure that our sin will find us out. He's warned us about that. Ephesians 4, 15 and 16. If I'm going to flip over to Ephesians. Ephesians 4, 15 and 16. This is a warning. But speaking the truth in love, and may grow up in all things with him, who is the head of Christ, for whom the whole body fit together, and together by the every joint supplies everything according to the working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself. So we all work together and we all prosper together. We are a team. And we all need to, when we talks about the body and how it all fits together, that's how this church is. We all have different parts that we do and play, and we all fit together. And one part's missing, another part is to compensate. Somebody gets a sore foot on one side, and they got to carry their weight on the other side to kind of compensate. And the next thing you know, that part starts wearing out. We're all made to work together. Your body's made together to work as a unit. And when one part starts failing, another part compensates, and eventually that causes an issue there. I thought about something this morning. Donnie Hoskinson, you guys can remember him in the old building over there. He always used to pray that we would all do our part. And I thought about that. There was a lot of wisdom in that, but he always prayed that we would do our part. And that's pretty much what this lesson's been about from Moses. Those guys weren't going to do their part, and he called them out on it, and they repented of that. Matthew 25 and 40. You know, if we got to realize if we don't do our part, it will come out, and we'll have to answer for that at some point in time, on Judgment Day especially. This is Matthew 25, if you would turn over there. Nobody wants to be guilty of this. Matthew 25, verses 24 through 30. Then he had received that one talent. This is the parable of the talents that we're talking about right here. He gave three men, three different things to take care of. And basically, you know, we use the term skills. I think in this case, it was money that it was referring to. They gave him 3 sets of money to guard over while he went away. Verse 24, then he came and received the one talent and said, Lord, I knew you were a hard man, reaping not where you had sown and scattering where you had not gathered seed. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours. But his Lord answered and said, you wicked and lazy servant, you knew I'd reap where I have not sown, and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and in my coming, I would have received my own with interest. Therefore, take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and to he who have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And they cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We don't want to be that guy. We don't want to be going to judgment for the Lord and says, why didn't you do something for me? Why did you just sit here in a corner and just stay in place? That's not what he said. I asked you to do some work for me, and you just hid. And he said, I didn't lose it. I didn't lose your stuff, Lord. Here it is back. He says, I don't want that. I asked you to go do something for me, do some work for me, and show some gain. We don't want to be this person on Judgment Day. In conclusion, when Reuben and Gad had realized the effect of sitting while their brothers went to war, they immediately made arrangements to do their part. Moses was patient with them. He listened to their story. Even allowing them times, he allowed them time to go get a place prepared for their families. They built some cities. They built some pens to keep their animals while they were away. He gave them a chance. He didn't say, you got to go right now. So he was reasonable. He pointed it out, and then they in turn promised to do their part in going to war, and that was in Numbers 32. And they did their part. They made an oath, they made a promise, and they kept it. Certainly we can be patient in helping our brothers prepare for war if we need to. But we all must be determined not to rest until the work is done by resolving to be more diligent in our spiritual battle for the Lord, finding our part, finding our place, engaging, fighting that fight for the Lord. We don't want to go to Judgment Day and have to answer like the one talent man did. I don't want anybody to have to go there. And we try to make opportunities for this congregation, so we don't have to worry about that. We try to find things that we all can do, and there's personal work that we can do. So whatever it is, just find your place, find your niche, but don't get complacent, don't get comfortable. We should be fighting to the bitter end, because that's what the Israelites did. They said, we won't stop until this war is over with, and then we'll go home and rest. And we know our rest is on Judgment Day. That's the end of my sermon. I hope it sounded a little bit beneficial. Again, I was trying to tie back into our study on Wednesday night, and I thought about that. I'm like, yeah, that was a good lesson for us as you look about it. Those Israelites made a mistake, and they were almost making that same mistake a whole generation later, and they realized it and caught themselves. And that's what we're going to do here too. We're going to keep pushing ahead, pushing hard, trying to find a place. And you all do a great job here. Don't think I'm trying to hammer anybody. I'm just trying to encourage us to not get comfortable. That's the thing, right? Don't get comfortable where you're at. Always realize you can do better. And thank you all for everything that you do here. And like I said, just keep looking. And this time we had our class filled up. It was wonderful. I know this is the first time in several years that we had more teachers than we had spots for. And thank you for that. So just keep pushing, keep working. And I want us all to get to heaven. That's all I want to do here. And I love everybody here. And we just want to keep pushing forward. I will say that baptistry's empty right now. We had the plumber fix it on Friday, and we'll have it filled up. If anybody here wants to get baptized today, I'll find a place for you. Don't let that be the reason we don't do it. Because that's the first step. That's the first step to be enrolled in the Lord's army is you have to be a Christian. You know, and be called a Christian. You can't say I'm a Christian if you've never been baptized. That's just not the way it works. You can say, I like to follow the teaching of Jesus and I live that lifestyle. But if you've not been baptized, you are not a Christian. Just realize that. That's just the way it is. That's what he said. It wasn't me, that's him. Gonna be one of my children, you got to be baptized. So don't ever forget that. That's your first step. If somebody's here today, we want to make that first step, we would love to help you take care of that. So if we can help you today, please come while we stand and sing.